Okay, so sorry for that delay. There's always issues with computers, right? So all of you have freshly imaged machines. They just imaged them, so they should all have the newest of the new on everything, which could be a good thing, but could be a bad thing. We don't know for sure yet until you guys work on them. So if you run into any problems, let me know, because we're trying to work out those kinks. Obviously, these are the kinds of things that should have been done before the semester started, but somehow we're halfway through it and we're doing them now, but it is what it is. So today we're going to continue in the world of graphic design. And I think one of the most important places to start in graphic design or related to graphic design is typography, which basically means fonts, type, text, those kinds of things. And we have to really work through the details of that. Has anybody ever watched the keynote speech that was given by Steve Jobs at the Stanford commencement in about 2006? Anybody ever watch that? A couple of you? If you haven't ever watched it, Google it and watch it tonight as homework. I never give you homework, but this is homework, right? You really should, because it's very insightful video about design and where he got where he got. And one of the things that he references in that particular speech is that fonts and typography really inspired him a lot in terms of the world of computers, and what he wanted to create was simply because of the ability to change typefaces and work with typefaces. And that's something we really want to emphasize, and that you probably have encountered already in your classes here at DVC. Certainly if you're in 121 and you did a poster, you probably did it the first draft and had Daniel look at it and say, you picked the wrong font. Right? Anybody have that happen? Right? A few of you, right? That's because font choice really, really matters. So let's kind of give you this overview. Let's start with the definition of terms. So in the beginning, a lot of these things sound obvious, right? Style, is it regular? Is it italicized? Or is it bold? Okay? They're often used to provide some kind of a contrast between text, right? You're writing along in your English paper, well, maybe not your English paper. You're writing along in some paper, right? And you want to draw emphasis to a particular part. You make it italicized or you make it bold, right? And it draws emphasis to that, okay? We have two ways of making a font italicized or making it bold. One is, like, let's say you're working in Word. You go to the Edit menu and you say bold, right? Or you want it italicized and you say, you go up to that Edit menu and say italicized. That's a operating system operation. So the operating system is taking the font and making it thicker, or it's taking the font and skewing it. Okay? The other option that we have, and you may have noticed this in some fonts, is that as you look at the list of fonts, there might be Helvetica New, but then underneath that, as a subcategory, there'll be light, thin, regular, bold, etc. Right? And those choices within the font menu generally are versions or styles of your font that have actually been designed by the typeface designer in the first place, right? So instead of just making all the characters thicker, right, or all the characters slanting over, the designer actually has thought about what should be thicker and what shouldn't be thicker, how thick it should be, right? It's not an arbitrary choice. So if you can, you want to choose your bold from that list. Weight refers to a relative lightness or darkness of the letter forms, right, marked by changes in the line width that make up that character, right? So we might have a light, right, which is a very thin line. We might have a medium. Sometimes it's referred to as regular, which is kind of a thick-ish but not too thick line. And then we have bold, which is a very thick line, right? And so that has to do with the relative lightness or darkness of the characters once you actually draw it. Okay? Width refers to different variations within a typeface family. So you might have something that's condensed, which basically means it's squished, right? And the letters are closer together, and the letters might be taller and narrower, right? You might have something where it's extended, where the type is drawn out. And not every font family has everything, right? But if it's extended, the letters are going to be a little bit wider than normal. So we're stretching things out. Okay? You guys have probably experienced that before when you needed to make your English paper a little bit longer, right? You played around. This is probably in high school, right? Where you played around and you made the font a little bigger, or you extended, right? Yeah. Yeah, we all know that trick. Okay? So let's talk about X height. X height is a very, very important way of explaining or understanding a font and identifying what its characteristics are. And basically what it is, it's the height of a lowercase x. Right? We call it x height. Different fonts have different x heights, so that the lowercase letters are different heights. And we want to make sure when we're picking fonts that go together that the x heights are the same. Right? So there's certain characteristics that are important. Okay? Sometimes we need to look at an image. I have an image here that will go through all this again. Okay? Cap height refers to the height of the capital letters. So we have x height, which is the lowercase letters. We have cap height, which is the capital letters. Right? It's measured from the baseline to the cap line. Right? And depending on your font, these values are going to vary. And so in order for you to understand the font, you have to understand these two things about it. So if we look at it here, right, our cap height goes from the baseline to the cap height. Right? Our x height is the height of a lowercase letter, baseline there. We also have characters that have ascenders and descenders, right? The B's and G's and F's, right? They stick up into the cap line or they stick down below the baseline. Okay? Counters are white spaces located inside and around letter forms, right? They affect legibility or readability of fonts, right, based on density. If you have a really thin font at a very large type size, they might have what's called open counters, which means there's just too much space around them to really read the letters. It gets a little hard to read, right? The opposite is true. If you have a small font and it's really bold, you can't read the counters, and so it's much more difficult to read. So something like this, right? We might have errors, right? But if you look at it quickly, it's a little bit hard to read because you have to concentrate on the letters and say, because there's so much space around the font, right? Likewise, if you have a little tiny thing, and this is a little unfair because it's projected so it's bigger than it's supposed to be. It's supposed to be really tiny, right? All of that space kind of goes away and it becomes much more of a black block, right? It's harder to read. So depending, you have to be aware of this, right? And so it's probably somewhere in the middle. Small capitals, right, are a complete set of uppercase letters that are the x height of your letters. So instead of having the full height capitals, right, up to the cap line, you shrink the cap line down, right? You shrink the letters down so that they're the height of the x height. The value here is that you're not providing overemphasis for an acronym or something. Let's say you're writing in your history paper and you need to type, I don't know, some abbreviation. Okay? If you did it in all capital letters that are the full cap height, right, it would draw a lot of attention to those letters. Right? If we do it at a small capital, you don't draw as much attention to it. It fits in with the flow of the text, but you can still use all capitals. Okay? Lining and non-lining figures. Figures refer to numbers in this sense, right? And it has to do with how the heights of the numbers. I think the easiest way of explaining it is to actually look at the examples. Okay? So lining figures put the number at the baseline, and they have the cap height as the top of the numbers. So 1, 2, 3, they're all going to line up like this. Non-lining figures are much easier in the flow of text. Right? If you're writing your English paper and you need to use numbers, it's much easier to use non-lining figures because they don't stand out. They're not as big as the cap height, the regular lining numbers. Right? What happens is that we get descenders. So something like a 3 isn't going to fit here. It ends up being below. You've probably encountered this before in a particular font. Right? And so it just has to do with the heights of the numbers and the readability of those numbers, or in the case of the technical term, figures. Ligatures are specially designed characters that happen when normal characters collide. Right? And what they do is they replace, like if you had FF and I, they would replace FF and I with a special character that eliminated the collisions. Sometimes it's easier to see them. Right? If we have, and you do this naturally when you write, right? If you end a word with 2 T's, what do? You cross both T's together, right? Right? Same thing if you had 2 F's together, you would cross the F's together, right? It's a natural thing that we do. So instead of having 2 F's next to each other, we have a special character that combines the F and puts the bar across the 2, right? Similar here, F and an I, the resulting top is really ugly, right? So instead we have an F and we connect them together, right? So we're combining those characters. Same thing with an F and an L, FFI, right? Same kind of a combination, right? A good font and a good operating system will do this automatically for you. As you put those characters in, it will substitute. So let's talk a little bit about how you choose the right font, right? We already talked about you were in 121 and you did your first poster. Maybe it was a Mondrian poster. I don't know which the first one was. And you picked a font, and you picked Times New Roman, for example. And Daniel looked at it and said, "Ooh, no, you can't use that font," right? How do we pick the right font? So typeface selection, okay? What's the longevity of the piece, right? How timeless does the piece need to be, right? That's relevant. What's the purpose of the piece, right? If you're doing a poster about Mondrian, right, it's a modernist poster, therefore the font should reflect that, right? So what is the purpose, right? Is it innovative or outdated, right? So I like to bring up a side note here, and unfortunately I start to date myself when I bring up these kinds of things. Anybody ever watch Lord of the Rings, the movies? Right? Maybe you watched that, right? I know they came out a long time ago. For me, it wasn't that long ago. So Lord of the Rings used a font in those movies called Papyrus, right? And you'd recognize it. You'd say, "Oh yeah, that's the Lord of the Rings font," right? Well, it became super, super trendy in about 2002, right? And it was everywhere. You go to a restaurant, and the menu would be printed in Papyrus. Like everybody was using it. It was great, right? And now you look at it, and you're like, "Oh, that's so old," right? It happens. So there are trends to fonts. There are things that happen for a while, and then they get kind of old, right? And so you could do this. We could go back further, but that's the most relevant recent example, right? Is it traditional or is it too conservative, right? Those kinds of things you want to think about as well, right? One of the good ways of doing it is to compare side by side, and it's really easy to do in InDesign, where you have a version that has one font, you do another page that has a different font in it, you can compare the two, you can print the two, and you can see which one is really working. You want to compare for readability, right? Is it evoking the right emotion? Is it legible? Can you read it, right? And does it reflect the needs of the client or the viewer, right? So this is kind of a fun chart. The periodic table of typefaces. It's kind of a play on the periodic table of elements from your chemistry class, right? It's kind of the same thing, starting with simple and working their way down into the more complex as we get heavier in the elements, so to speak. But it's kind of fun to look at. I really like this graphic. I think it's great. It's always a little hard to see on the screen, but I think we've gotten it a little bit better. So so you need a typeface, right? And you start here in the center box, and it says, okay, what do you want to do? I want to build a book, right? So I come up here to book. Are you completely in doubt? Yes or no, right? Depending on if you pick yes, you end up over there at Castellon. If you say no, right? A champion in usability perhaps? Yes or no, right? And you see that you continue following the chain. It's kind of fun, right? It's not perfect, right? Let's say you wanted to do a logo, right? It's going to ask you a sans serif or a serif. Right, and then it's going to shoot you over, right? How does the word semi-sans and semi-serif sound, right? Do you say good or bad? If you say good, it comes down here and you get rhotus, right? If you say bad, it comes down here. Something new, got serifs, got sans, good or bad, right? And you get the idea, right? Is it an Italian restaurant? Yes, come down here. You're using Bodoni, right? So it's just kind of fun, right? I would spend a little bit of time playing around with this just for the amusement of it. I have on the page, today's lecture, I have this in high resolution so you can actually go in and see it. So the other thing that happens is sometimes we want to combine typefaces together. And so if we're going to do that, we have to think a little bit carefully about whether we really want to do it or not. If you use a single type family, let's say you use Helvetica New, and it has it has light, it has thin, it has regular, it has bold, it has all these various options. You can stick within that one font family, right? It's all going to go together nicely, and you're just going to use those variants, which is good. Okay? If you add multiple families together, you'll obviously extend the ability or the variety that you can create. The key is that you have to be a little bit careful with how you combine them together, right? Generally, you're not going to pick two sans serif fonts and put those together, or two serif fonts and put those together. So when I speak of a sans serif or a serif, I'm speaking about the readability of the font, right? So a serif font has these little tiny tails, right, as part of the characters of the letters. And what that does is when we read like a book, right, like you go home and you pick out one of the books that you're trying to read. Hopefully it's not like a textbook, like this is for enjoyment purposes, right? Like you pick up Harry Potter to go read, right? It's going to be printed in a serif font with these little tiny tails, okay? That's because it helps our brains recognize what the characters look like. It helps us to read better, okay? A sans serif is something like this. It doesn't have any of the tails on it, right? So it's a cleaner, more modern font. It's a little bit harder to read, though our brains have gotten used to reading it. We can still read it fairly easily, okay? But if we're going to combine two typefaces together, we wouldn't want two of the same style fonts. We wouldn't want two sans serif fonts together because they collide with each other, right? Because these are distinctly different, they work nicely as a pair. Okay? So there's a variety that are commonly put together. I can't tell you off the top of my head all the combinations, right? The best way to find a font that goes with one is to find the font that you like and then say font that goes with into Google, you know, Garamond, and it'll spit out some fonts that go with it, right? And the reason that it's picking fonts is because chances are they have the same X heights and they have the same cap heights. And with those two, they'll go together nicely. Okay? So these are some examples of ones that go together nicely. We also have display and script typefaces. These are the fancy fonts, right? Used for a headline or something big, right? They're almost like an art piece, right? Let's say you're doing a wedding invitation and you have all the calligraphy and the swirls and all that stuff, right? There are fonts that mimic that, and that's for a special purpose, right? You're not going to write your English paper in that, or your English teacher is going to send it back to you and say, what are you thinking, right? So just colored examples, etc. Right? Designing with type. You want to think a lot about legibility and readability. Right? If you want to communicate something and it has text in it, the first important thing is to make sure somebody can actually read it and understand what it's saying. And if you make it too hard for them, it's difficult. So legibility is the recognition of individual letter forms, right? And their relative position to other letters. So that's legibility. Readability is how the typography is presented to the viewer as words, lines, and paragraphs, right? Because that's the readability of it. Objective representation would be practical, straightforward, clear, ordered, right? Bold, sub-bold, right? Bullet points, etc. Organization. Subjective is conceptual or interpretive, right? Where you might have varying fonts, right? Heavily focused on a theme or an idea, right? But you can do this sort of a layout as well. You want to think very carefully at the macro perspectives, right? Which is what the overall design would be, right? The big layout, the big picture, right? It's the format of the composition, and what are the general typographic hierarchies that you're going to establish. One of the things that I'll be very critical about when you do your posters for assignment 103, right, is did you establish a strong hierarchy of type? Right? Do you have bold? Do you have something that you focus on first? As you get closer and read more, you get to the sub-level, then you get to the further detail. Right? Do you establish that hierarchy, which will help with the placement of elements. Micro perspectives are the small details, the kerning, the spacing, the ragging, and we'll talk about what those are, and I'll show you examples of what they are in just a second. Right? That ensures the clean presentation. So you want to think about the little details in addition to the big picture stuff. Right? So here's something, I think it's in German, doesn't really matter what the language is, but we have a clear hierarchy. We have the big bold text, we have some smaller text, right? We have some blue text that comes in afterward, right? There's an established hierarchy that lets us know what we should read first, what we should read second, and what we should read third. Right? Symmetry and asymmetry, right? Depending on what you're trying to create, are you trying to have balance? Are you having symmetry across pages? Is it asymmetrical activity? Are you trying to draw attention to something? So let's say you're designing a poster, maybe asymmetry is a good strategy. Right? If you're designing a book, maybe symmetry is the right strategy. So you have to think about what that purpose is and therefore reflect it in your overall design layout. So alignment is the horizontal and vertical position of the typography within the margins. Right? Where do you put the type on the page? Right? Alignment creates the visual relationship among the elements of design. So let's say you have type and you have a photo. Right? How do they position on the page and how do they relate to one another? That matters. Right? A couple examples. Right? Typographic color is also something that's important. This refers to the density of the elements and their perceived gray value. Right? So you're in the very back and you're looking up here. You obviously can't read what any of these say. right? Or maybe you have super eyesight and you can't. But generally speaking, if you were in the back, you couldn't see what these say. But you could point out which paragraphs are darker and which paragraphs are lighter, right? So this principle still comes across. So depending on the font size, right, the legibility, the readability, those kinds of things, we can have darker paragraphs and lighter paragraphs. And it doesn't necessarily mean that some of the fonts are bigger than others, right? It just means that their density is different, the kerning's different, the tracking's different, the leading's different, and that creates this general gray perception. And so this thing still, we're talking about typography, but let's say you're doing your final posters for your architecture, right? You want to think about how dark is the text. If you have a block of text, it's an element when you're looking at that poster, and what does it do for your overall presentation? Type size is measured in points. You guys are probably all familiar with like 12 point, right? You're also familiar with 13 because you wanted to make your English paper a little bit longer because it had to get to that last page, right? Guess what? We know all the tricks in the book. Professors always know, right? Because we did them when we were in school. Changes in type size often result in a very nice hierarchy. So sometimes you don't even need to change from bold to italic, to condensed, to extended, to light, to thin. Sometimes you just need 14 point, 12 point, and 10 point, right? And that hierarchy is a very nice, clean hierarchy, right? They develop a proportionate scale of sizes, right, that work together. The other thing that matters is case, right? Lowercase letters are more readable than uppercase letters, right? Uppercase emphasizes letter-to-letter recognition, which slows down reading. So if you want to think about making somebody really concentrate on reading something, if you make it all uppercase, people have to spend more time reading it than they do lowercase. So let's try an experiment. Okay? For example, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in the word appear. The only important thing is that the first and last letter are in the right place. Pretty fun, huh? Right? Because our brains are trained to recognize words, right? And there's a certain order to words, and generally we read the first and the last letter, right? So this is relatively easy to read. It might start off a little bit hard, but then you get into the flow of it, and it's pretty easy to read. Okay? If we switch, however, to this, and we try to read this, for example, it doesn't matter in what order the letters in a word appear, etc., right? It's much harder to read because we have to concentrate on each individual letter because they're all in capitals. They're not the general form of the word. Does that make sense? All right, so this is a very clear way of understanding capital letters are much harder to read together, right? And you can use that to your advantage. Kerning adjusts the spacing between individual letters. It's used to correct letter collisions, right, and unwanted spaces between letters, right? It allows the text to flow and read smoothly. Again, this is something that you do automatically when you write words. So if I was writing type, for example, right, T-Y-P-E, right, notice that I stick the Y underneath the top of the T, right? I don't write it T. That looks funny. Right? So naturally, I do this. And we're doing the same thing here because we're correcting it. Right? So there's the default spacing. The Y starts after the top of the T. Right? There's the corrected spacing. Same thing happens with uppercase letters. We get this weird collision here. Right? We spread them out. Okay? So this is kerning, individual spacing between letters. Tracking adjusts the spacing between words, lines, and paragraphs. Okay? It can greatly improve the readability, right? It's going to change the look of the paragraph. It's going to change how dark the paragraph is on a page, right? You don't want to track just a set of lowercase letters, right? You want to track whole sentences, right? And I'll show you an example as this goes. So you're learning right now that if you really need to make your English paper longer, instead of using the tricks about increasing the point size or using an extended font, right, you would instead adjust the tracking and it wouldn't look so goofy because you'd be doing it proportionally. Leading is the space between lines of text. So Word, unfortunately, kind of screwed all of us up because it started saying you have double space, 1.5 space, right? It's not really correct in the technical term. Leading is measured between the lines of text, and it's usually a reference based on the point size of the font that you choose. Right? So it's not double spacing, right? If you had a 12-point font, right, chances are you'd have about a 14-point leading between the two for single space. Okay? So we'll show you what that does. The taller the X heights or heavier typefaces, sans serifs need more leading than shorter, wider serif typefaces. Right? There's a reason that in a book, if you're reading a paperback book, they use a serif typeface because they can cram more words onto the page and it's still readily readable. Okay? Just a few more examples. This is way too light. Yeah, these aren't turning out well. This is a good example. You can look at it afterward of capital letters emphasizing a quotation. So you have to think about that quotation versus the lowercase letters. Yeah, these are all getting washed out. OK, so let's switch over. I'm going to stop recording here. We're going to switch over. I have character styles and I have paragraph styles. Okay, these are reusable templates for something that you want to have happen. So let's start with character styles. Right? And right now, if I click on character style, all I have is none. So let me go ahead and create a new one. So I'm going to click on the little new button here. And when I click on new, it's called character style 1. And let's go ahead and rename this. Let's say this should be, I don't know, quotation. Actually, instead of that, because it's not an actual quotation, let's call it emphasis. Right? So I'll call it emphasis. Now, if I double-click on emphasis, right, it's going to bring up the character style options. So you can see here in the character style options that if I go to basic character formats, I can change what the font is. Right? So let's say I change it to sorry, I have to decide what I'm going to change it to. We'll call it Franklin Gothic. Sure. Okay. Then the style will go regular. The size will be 16 point. Right? And then I could adjust individual characters, leading, tracking, kerning, etc. Right? If I continue to advanced character formats, there's nothing that I really need to do. I could change the character color. Right? I could change the character to always be blue. Right? And there's little else that we end up wanting to change. So I'll go ahead and say OK. And so now, whatever characters I select, right? So let's say I select the here. If I click on emphasis, it's going to change the font and the color to match. And at any point, I can choose, right, to have that applied. So it's a reusable style, so to speak, right? Which makes long papers really easy because you can start to establish these styles. So that has to do with the font, the color, right, the characters, etc. Paragraph styles, on the other hand, are a little bit more involved. So let me go ahead and click on the new, and we'll call this indent emphasis, indent highlight. Okay, so I have indent highlight here. If I double click on it, it will bring up the paragraph style options. So notice that I have some repeats here. I have basic characters that I can choose to adjust. If I don't change anything here, it will stick with whatever the defaults are, right? Whatever the ones that are superseded with the character style. But if I come down here and we get to indents and spacing, this is the first one that really matters. What I want is that this is going to be, let's call it centered, let's call it left, justified, right? I want to indent by a bit, right? Remember, my units right now aren't in inches, but if I wanted to specify in inches, I could say a ½ inch, and it would translate it for me. Okay, as we come down here, tabs really don't matter. Paragraph rules, right? If I wanted something special to happen, I could use that. Hyphenation turns on hyphenate or not hyphenate. If I get to justification, I can adjust that as well. We're going to keep coming down here. Bullets and numbering, right? If I wanted there to be bullets or numbers, I can choose to turn those on. Right? Let's say I wanted bullet points. I can choose what my character would be for that bullet point. I could also load a different character. Right? I can again change the particular color, etc. So once I'm done here, I'll go ahead and say OK. And what this does is it applies to a paragraph. So let me go back to normal. Right? Then let me select on any paragraph, say paragraph 4 here, if I click on indent highlight, it does that to the paragraph. Okay? I could take this a step further. Right? This is why we have the ability. See how it says same style here. Let's go to character formats. Let's change this to be italics. I'll say OK. Right? And now this paragraph changes to italics. So not only can I specify and reuse the style over and over again, but I can, after the fact, edit the style and have it change my whole document. Right? So if I have this particular, let's say I had a subheading that was reoccurring throughout my document. Right? If I wanted to change what that subheading looked like, I can just edit the style and it would change everywhere in my document. Right? So it's a really, really useful way of working with your styles. So we also have a couple other options. Right? So let me go back into my indent highlight here. I'm going to come back to my bullets and numbering. I'm going to turn this to numbers instead. You can see that the format is 1, 2, 3, but I could change it to any one of these. Right? So there it is. And I'm going to come here to drop caps and nested styles. So what drop caps does is it says create the first character, make that larger. So you guys remember like the old English books where they had the really stylized first character and then the text continued? I can do the same thing here. So, right, so let's say that the drop cap should be 2 lines and it's 1 character. Let's do 2 characters. And I'll go ahead and say OK. Now, see how the 4, which is the first character here, is going to be significantly larger. Okay? If I change that again, let me turn off the numbering so that it's not so confusing. Let's turn this off to none. Drop caps, if I went to 4 lines, the 4 is going to get even bigger. Right? And so once again, this is repeatable. So if I went to the first paragraph and I clicked on indent highlight, right, it matches. Right, so you can see how I can reuse this over and over again. If I didn't like it, double click, go back to the bullets and numbering, or excuse me, go back to the drop caps. Let's go back down to only 2. I'll say OK. And both of them adjust. Okay? So it takes a little bit of practice to get used to this, but if you set up your paragraph styles and your character styles in advance, it makes working with a long document really, really easy. Okay? Okay, a couple other things that can be done. Right? Let me go ahead and make this text box a little bit smaller here. Right? And this time I'm going to create a shape. I'm going to use an ellipse, an elliptical frame, so it has the X in it. And I'm going to place the text, continue chaining it into this frame. And you can see that it now follows the frame itself. So I have the ability to do any shape that I want and place the text in any shape that I want. Right? Furthermore, I can create a frame. Let's do a rectangular frame this time. Let's put it right here. And let me go to File and then Place. And let me place an image into that frame. And in reality, I should go find a let's see here, a better image. But let's say I drop this image in. I'm going to right-click and go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. Right. So there's an image. I just put a photograph in. Right. If I place this into my document like that, right now. Right, there it is. Right now, the text is behind the document. Okay? But I can choose, hold on a second here. This needs to go over that. But I can choose to flow the text around that document. So if I come over here and I go to Text Wrap, which is another option, right? I can choose to wrap around the particular document. Oops, sorry, I have to click on the document, the photo. I can say wrap around the photo, so it goes around the photo. I can say break for the photo. And as I move the photo around, oops, sorry, I double-clicked instead of single-clicked. Oh, come on. There we go. As I move this around, you can see that the text flows around that image. Right? So I can create lots of images and put them in and have the text flow around the images as well. Hold on one second. Sorry about that. OK. So let's say that there is a font that I would really like to use, but it's not on this system. Okay? I can choose to use another font that isn't on the system, and I'm going to follow a tutorial to do that. So I'm going to go to Tutorials, Digital Life, and we're going to go to, oops, wrong one, the AMP font viewer, which is right here, 0.15. Let me go ahead and make this bigger. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this link because I have to download a little application. And I'm going to click on this Download Now. And it should start in just a second. Maybe. Come on. How nice, right? I'm going to click on the direct link and see if it'll do it. And it still won't download for me. There we go. I had to click to start it manually. I don't know why it wouldn't start on my own. All right, so there it is. Let me go ahead and show it in the folder. I'm going to copy it to my flash drive. And I'm going to put it in the resources folder for right now. Let me go ahead and paste it. And then I need to extract it. So I'm going to right-click and select Extract All and extract. So we can't, on these computers, because they're locked, we can't actually install any fonts in the system. So we're going to use this temporary application that will allow us to temporarily install a font. Okay? So the other factor is that I need the font. So I'm going to go and browse for a font. And you can Google it. Font Squirrel is a good place for free fonts. We click on it. We can see a variety of fonts. See if I can find one that looks interesting. Right, that one looks kind of interesting. So if I click on it, it's going to download as a zip file. And go again, Show in Folder, and I'm going to copy it. This one's called Droid. I'm going to put it on my flash drive. I'll put it in the Resources folder, and I'll put it in a Fonts folder. And let me go ahead and paste it. And then extract it. I'll right-click, Extract All. And there it is. Okay. So now, if I go back to my flash drive, and I double-click on the font viewer, if I click on fontviewer.exe, it's going to open this font viewer. And it shows me a preview of all the fonts that are currently on my system, but it will actually allow me to go open another font. So I'm going to click on Not Installed Fonts. I'm going to go to my flash drive. I'm going to go to my Resources folder. I'm going to go to Fonts. And there's the Droid font right there. Right? And I can say Install Font Temporarily. Yes, I want to install it temporarily. And now it's in my list of fonts. The key here is that I have to leave this program open. I can't close it or the font won't be there anymore. So I'll go ahead and close this, or just minimize it. And I'm going to need to save my InDesign file and then open it again, because once InDesign's already open, it won't reload the font. So I can look for it just in case, but I don't believe it's going to be there. Oh, it is. There it is as Droid, so I don't have to restart. Right? And let me go ahead and change my character styles back to none. I might just retype it. Get rid of this. And let me take this, and I'm going to change the font to be that Droid font. If I can find it. There it is. Now let's make it bigger. And so now I can load a custom font. So the point being that if you have a font that you want to use, you can make sure that you load it. Okay? So that's part 2, is being able to load that font. Right? And it looks like you don't need to restart InDesign. It looks like the computers have taken care of that. Once I'm done, I want to make sure that I save my work as an InDesign file, which is an INDD file. So I'm going to go to File and then Save As, or excuse me, just File Save. It's going to say InDesign CS6 document, and right now it's untitled1.indd. So this is exercise 112.indd. I'm going to make sure it goes on my flash drive. And I'll go ahead and click Save. So you won't be able to post the InDesign file, but it's the file that you're going to continue to work with if I open it up and want to change something. Okay, so at that point, you're going to export either a JPEG or a PDF. If you were going to print this document, chances are you'd make it a PDF. Or if it was a multi-page document, chances are you'd make it a PDF. For today, we're going to export a JPEG, just like we did before, because it's easier to post to the website. So I'm going to go to File, Export. I'm going to change my Save As type to be JPEG. And it's exercise 112.jpg. I'll click Save. I want to make sure that my quality is on maximum and my resolution is at 300. And I'll go ahead and click on Export. And it will export this first page for me. Okay? So I can confirm that it's there. I can jump over to my flash drive. 112. There it is as a JPEG. Perfect. So this is what I'm going to post. Okay? So your job is to create the first page of this Vitruvius chapter, playing around with the paragraph styles, the character styles, becoming very familiar with this because you're going to need it as you go forward. Okay? Are there any questions? No? Okay. Good.